out to God, it reads in one place. Let tears stream down like a torrent day and night. Arise, cry out in the night. Pour out your heart like water. Lift your hands to God for the lives of your children who faint for hunger at the head of every street. Grief as a way of naming something wrong in the world. Grief felt deeply as an aspect of our faith. And it's worth noting that less than half of the Psalms of Lament that are in the Bible, less than half of them make it into the lectionary or into our hymnals. They're not there. They take them out. We prefer, it seems, to avoid grief, even in our reading of Scripture. It's kind of fascinating. Mm-hmm. We engage in ritualistic forms of grief after terrible events like the mass shooting in Las Vegas, or last year at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. But these moments of awareness soon pass without any real change in response to these events or to the less conspicuous gun deaths and mass shootings that happen on a daily basis. Not to mention all the other forms of suffering, injustice, and death that afflict those struggling with poverty, hunger, and homelessness in our world. In contrast, Jesus was remembered as the suffering servant of Isaiah, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. In the Gospel of Luke, it tells us, as Jesus came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "If you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes." Again, an image of Jesus weeping over the brokenness of the city and what he saw happening there. For Jesus and the prophets, grief wasn't only an individual or communal response to loss, but a deep expression of how far the world has strayed from God's vision of how it might be. It was yet another form of bearing prophetic witness in the midst of a world that often wants to whitewash grief, paper over loss, and insist that everything is okay, even when it's clearly not. So the parables we read today from Isaiah and Jesus were meant to awaken the people of their time to the bloodshed and injustice all around them, and to the failure of God's people to bear the fruit of life and peace in their lives and in their society. God expected justice, but saw bloodshed, Isaiah cried. God expected righteousness, but heard only a cry. And how often we might imagine the same thing being said of our world today. In a way, these parables are a call to grief, a call to bring what is happening in the world to awareness and to name it and grieve it openly in order to begin to respond to it in genuine ways. Until we acknowledge, for example, the depth of the loss and suffering that are happening in our country with every single gun-related death, until people can feel that grief as their own, nothing will change. The same is true of other forms of injustice and suffering in the world. Until that grief touches us, we'll simply take note of it and move on, fearful of the pain that it represents. Yet by avoiding the great grief of our neighbors in this way, we also inadvertently avoid the kind of connection to them that could be the source of life and joy for us and the possibility of real change in the world. Grieving together in the context of spiritual community is one way that we begin that task, begin that journey together. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann said, "The prophetic counter to denial in society is the practice of grief that acknowledges loss. An acknowledgement that summons the city, summons the wider world to be fully, deeply, and knowingly engaged in its actual life experience, what is actually happening. Set this down," he wrote. "Sadness over loss that is unvoiced, unembraced, and unacknowledged turns to violence." And I think he means that generally. It could be a sense of violence toward oneself, violence toward one's neighbor, or very literally, violence, unexpressed sadness can turn to violence and preclude movement toward a new possibility for us or for society. The prophetic task amid a culture of denial, he said, is to embrace, model, and practice grief in order that the real losses in our lives and in our society can be acknowledged and we can begin the pursuit of new social possibilities that lie beyond our own vision and our own comfort zones. In that sense, our practice of communal grief over the shootings in Las Vegas and other forms of injustice is an important public way of naming something terribly wrong in our world, some way in which our world has strayed from God's vision of how it might be, how it ought to be, as well as the ways that we have failed to bear the fruit of life and peace in our own lives.